I understand you've had dual duty this morning.
Yes, sir, I have. I'm learning the difficulties that legislators face every day with this running from committee to committee. Mr. Chairman and members, my name is Billy Hamilton. I'm Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Financial Officer of the Texas A&M University System. But as Chairman Otto said, I'm actually here testifying as an individual from my time at the Controller's Office. And the chairman asked me if I would present briefly some information on what other states do on their spending limits, and certainly you've heard a lot of discussion today on the Texas spending limit. I'd probably get in trouble with my boss if I didn't thank you for your work last session on higher education funding, but that's not what that's what I'm talking about today. Spending limits are part of a larger group of limitations, all designed to limit spending, called tax and expenditure limitations, or TELs. The goal is the same, is to control government spending either by limiting revenues or by limiting expenditures. The first TEL was proposed by Governor Reagan in California in 1973 as Proposition 1, and it is very similar to what you would think of today as a spending limit, and his advisors came up with that idea. It was actually defeated by the voters of California in a referendum after the legislature wouldn't deal with it. And then, of course, California had Proposition 13 a few years later, and a number of other limitations that have been placed. A number of states have enacted these tax and expenditure limits since the 1970s. They really began to be enacted in the late 1970s. There was a sort of a whole bait of them that was enacted between, say, 78 and 84. And then there was a second round in the early 90s. And really, since 2000, very few states have enacted, additional states have enacted limits, although a number of states have done, as you're doing here, discussed, how effective the limit is, whether it should be shifted or something like that. So only 4 states that I could find have enacted limits since 2000, and one of those, the most recent, Illinois enacted theirs in 2011, was really part of an agreement on a tax increase, a temporary tax increase, and when the tax increase went away, the limit also went away. So today there are either 28 or 31 states that have spending limits, depending on who's doing the counting. If you go by the National Association of State Budget Officers, the number is 28, but it's sort of fungible depending on what you consider as a limit. Texas has 4, of course. I think those have gotten a pretty good workout today: the main spending limit, the debt limit, the welfare limit, and the pay-as-you-go limit that controls revenue as opposed to expenditure. Most of the spending limits, or actually all of them, share really 5 kind of controlling policy levers. The target, what it is exactly they're trying to limit, revenue or an expenditure, or general revenue, non-dedicated general revenue, however you want to define it. The growth factor that's applied, most are adjusted by some measure of economic growth, like personal income growth, but some make adjustments for population and inflation. The number or type of overrides that are available to the legislature or to the people if they decide that they want to exceed the limit. The adoption methodology, whether it's a constitutional amendment, whether it's done by voter referendum, whether the legislature does it, and in a couple of rare cases, whether it's done by constitutional convention. And then finally, codification, whether it's in the statutes or in the Constitution. And if you think about all of those things, the degree of limit can be controlled by the decisions you make on each one. So, for example, a broader limit on a broader number of expenditure, a broader portion of the budget or a broader portion of revenues has a greater control than a more narrow one. A growth rate based on, say, inflation plus population growth would probably have a more of a constraint on the budget than one that was based on economic growth plus inflation plus population. An override that required only a simple majority would be much easier than the sort of override that requires a 2/3 vote or higher. Adoption by constitutional amendment and codification in the Constitution has a much higher level of rigidity than one that's in the statutes, which lawmakers could always change. The most common limits among all the TELs are spending limits, which 20 of the 28 states have. And again, I tried to come up with some sort of general measure of what they were limiting or how they were doing the limit, the sort of economic factors that were included. But you had some that were limiting by inflation, some by inflation plus population, some by economic growth, which is normally something like personal income growth, and then some that either have all three of those, economic growth, inflation, population, or a couple of them. So all the states seem to do it a little bit different. There are actually some states that limit expenditures based on a percentage of state personal income, so 5%. In one of the limits in Colorado, as Dale mentioned, there are several. It limits to 5% of personal income. Arizona to 7.41% of personal income, which I have no idea how they got to that. Some limit appropriations to a fraction of available revenue. So Delaware and Rhode Island are less concerned by the content of expenditures and merely say you can only spend 98% of the revenues that are available. So there's always that 2% that would be moved. 7 states include adjustments for population and or inflation on top of economic growth. California has a kind of 3-factor adjustment, for example, where Utah makes adjustments for inflation and population only. So again, they differ. The degree of toughness by the override varies again. Like Utah has 3/5. The Texas override on the pay-as-you-go limit is 4/5, but a simple majority to override the spending limit. And generally speaking, I would say, just to make a judgment on how tough or easy a spending limit should be, that it's something of a balancing act. I've been fortunate to work with legislatures for many years. I've always believed the best decisions are the ones made, as Theodore Roosevelt said, by the man, or I'm sure he meant woman, or in the arena, the persons who are there charged by the people with making the decisions on what's best for the state. But, spending limit controls can provide a very useful governor on spending or revenue. I know the Comptroller's office, when I was there, and I know they're sitting over there right now thinking pretty much the same thing. We always felt that the revenue estimate limits on pay-as-you-go was very important, not because we thought any given legislature would do anything, but simply because it provided a clear, bright line ceiling on state expenditures that told lawmakers, what they needed to do. There is a continuing argument in the sort of policy wonk press about the need The assumption that, letting expenditures grow with economic growth, which is a kind of a common assumption in the states with tax and expenditure limitations, that may not be invalid, that may be invalid, and that really the government should shrink as the economy grows. And so therefore you see a discussion. I think Mr. Heflin probably raised that discussion earlier today, where you make the adjustments in expenditures on some other basis which keeps it below the growth in spending over time. That's one philosophy, and governments make the decisions that they do. My only caution, and I'll use Colorado as a whipping boy too, as Dale did, is the tax and taxpayer Bill of Rights that Colorado enacted in the 1990s. It seemed like a terrific idea at the time. It was very conservative legislation. It was designed to limit revenues and expenditures. So tax increases could only be approved by the voters. Some types of taxes were prevented by law. And on the spending side, the spending limit each year was adjusted from prior year spending. And in the 1990s, Colorado was growing at a very rapid rate. So those adjustments made sense in the context of their government. And it funded a reasonable level of government. And in cases where, but there was also a provision in the bill that said if, for example, there's more revenue than the adjusted spending, you have to return the unused portion to the taxpayers. So the taxpayers some years got a little bit of refund, and the government continued to grow. And then in the 2002-03 recession, the expenditures sank, and there were dramatic cuts in state spending, and the state found out that they had what was called the ratchet problem, which is that the entire base of state spending rebased to a lower spending number, sort of a codified version of what Eva was talking about a little earlier. And even when revenues rebounded strongly, they were not only prevented by legislative decision, but were actually prevented by state law from increasing spending in key areas of the budget, including public education. And by 2005, they faced a significant problem. And Bill Owens, who was governor of Colorado, then he was actually a college classmate of mine, and is very conservative. He's an accountant. He has a really good, strong background in this, and I know this was probably the last thing he ever wanted to do in his entire life, but he had to compromise and go to the voters and ask them for a 5-year timeout on the spending limit so that they could rebalance their expenditures, not simply because that there were some groups that said we need to spend more money, but simply because they were so badly underspending in critical areas of the budget. And then since then, they have passed a voter, and the voters had to approve that, which they did. And then since then, the voters have approved a referendum C-cap, what's called a referendum C-cap, which rebases to the prior year's cap rather than the prior year's level of spending. So, it is possible to control yourself so tightly that when the time comes to make some other decision or to do something or to move in another direction, you simply have painted yourself into a corner. So, there is, and then finally, and this is the final thing, I'm sorry to have taken so much of your time in the noon hour, but there is a thought among academics that we haven't really seen the further spread of tax and expenditure limits in the 2000s. In other words, the last significant tax and expenditure limit was enacted in 2005. Illinois, I said, enacted one in 2011. It was purely part of a budget compromise, and they got rid of it. They need it probably as bad as any state, but they got rid of it. One reason that the spread may not have continued, at least in the academic, view of the world, is that legislatures have become more conservative, that people have become more conscious of the level of state expenditure and the impact of state expenditure on the state economy, and more importantly, interstate tax and economic competition has made it strategically difficult for states to have huge new expenditures on a wide range of budget items, simply because then they show up on all of these various lists as being uncompetitive with their neighboring states. So, some of these things in government tend to move in cycles. I certainly wouldn't advocate changing the limits that we have. We've learned, I believe the legislature has learned to deal with them well. I know you have considered some additional limits, and certainly if you do it, then the budget board and the controller and the other control agencies will make adjustments, and things will go on. But I think the record of the legislature in controlling spending and controlling, for that matter, the growth in revenues has been very good.